Alrighty, we are here with Amy for today's interview. Hello, Amy. Welcome.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
It's great to
Hi,
have you
Amy.
here.
It's really nice to have you. Thanks for joining us
Yeah,
today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
we're really excited to learn more about today's topic, which is about
Mhm.
student-centered learning, and learn a little bit about your experiences and kind of how you manage this and how you implement this. So, could you share a little about your teaching and educational journey so far, Amy?
Sure. I'm originally from South Korea and I was born and raised there. That's where I did my education. And then starting from the higher education from university, I started having my education in North America. So I first moved to the US, and then that's where I did my bachelor's. And then after
Mhm.
that, I moved to Canada, which where I am right now, and then did my master's recently. I actually just finished last December. And
Mhm.
then, yeah, I also got a little bit of teaching experience along with it. Yeah, so for me, having this topic, student-centered learning, was it's educational moment for myself as well as a learner.
Mhm.
So having that like traditional classroom background, like back home, how I was raised, and then having it different, like here for my universities and stuff was a
Mhm.
big difference that I felt as an educator as well.
And just on that, how would you define like student-centered learning versus traditional teacher-centered education, which is, as you mentioned, very
Right.
different here in Canada and in South Korea?
Exactly. Well, like how we view classrooms and like the roles of the teachers and students, right? So, student-centered
Mhm.
learning is how students learn, right? Like compared to like teacher-centered learning, it's more lecture-based, and
Mhm.
teachers bring the content to the students and the information, and it's more like information transfer. Right? Like
Mhm.
students supposed to like memorize all this and they should
Mhm.
know this, and like there's like objectives and stuff. But compared to that, student-centered learning is more about the student, right? Like how they relate to the content, the course content, and then more discussions and more than like just the teacher giving the information. It's about
Mhm.
students reflecting back on their own knowledge and also experience. I think that comes into play a lot.
Mhm.
Kind of like along the line, I think like experiential learning, it can be like part of it, right? So like having that experience and relating it to the course content. So like it's really about the students and how they absorb the information compared to just information's there and the student's supposed to learn. I think
Mhm.
that's the difference, really.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of, the impacts of student-centered learning, what was a kind of a defining moment for you where you realized, wow, this is much more impactful, it's much more engaging, I can get a lot more out of students. Kind of, was there a moment or a process that you kind of discovered with student-centered learning?
Um, yeah, so what I was really surprised about like student-centered learning and how it really works was also the teacher's role, actually. So,
Mhm.
because I feel like in teacher-centered classrooms, the teacher has the authority and it's kind of like they're the expert, right? And they know everything and kind of, right? That's the premise, right? And then they just teach the students and then the student just accepts it. I'm like, oh, right. And then they just learn. But compared to that, student-centered learning would be more of um, it can be like the teacher also can be a learner in a sense. So the teacher can learn from the students also compared to just teachers giving the information. So I think for me, when I think, well, as I said earlier, like student discussions, like discussion is a big part of student-centered learning, I believe, how students like give their own reflections and insights, right? Sharing it
Mhm.
with the classmates. I think that was the first moment that I felt, oh, it was very different. So
Mhm.
when I first started studying in the US, and I learned that I shouldn't be so passive and just sitting there in the
Mhm.
classroom, just listening to the teacher, right? Like they're always right. Compared to that, I had to bring something to the table. And
Mhm.
that's what really made me think, oh, I also should be the active learner compared to
Mhm.
just being passive.
Yeah, I always we notice this a lot with our students too, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
almost like a culture shock.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
And they're like,
exactly.
oh, you're asking me this?
right.
And then that's
Right.
that realization of like, oh, okay, this is different, almost like re-educating them in
Exactly.
classroom roles, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, for you as a teacher now, how has student-centered learning shaped your approach to teaching in ESL and EAP classrooms?
Mm-hmm. Right. So my experience as a learner heavily impacted my teaching approach as well, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
do follow student-centered learning in my own classroom as well. So when I teach ESL, what I really value is the students' opinions and how they view things too, right? So what I really like about teaching ESL is each of the student can be the resource, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
students can be the resources to each other, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
ESL teaching is not only about languages, but it's also about cultures and
Mm-hmm.
different backgrounds, right? So I think
Yeah.
so what I do a lot is I pair or group students who are from different parts of the world. So they have different languages, different cultures. So English is really the only medium that they can communicate. And I think that's the beauty of the ESL teaching, really,
Mm-hmm.
right? The students learn from each other. And then I also love having like grouping them and then just walking around circulating, see if things are going okay, like listening to the discussions and add on some of my opinions and something that I know of. And then that can also facilitate the student discussion as well. So that's how it looked like my
Yeah,
ESL classroom.
I
Mhm.
got it. It's again, it's that facilitator role more as a
Yes,
kind of, dictator, just
right.
saying and asking students to listen. And again, like Faye mentioned earlier, it's something that is a little bit unnerving and jarring when you meet students because they're not
Hmm.
used to this approach. They're not always familiar with it. So it can create
No.
some challenges sometimes. Are there any challenges that you faced when transitioning or trying to get your students to transition from this kind of traditional, kind
Mm-hmm.
of passive approach from the past to a more dynamic, student-centered approach?
Right. So I think at first when students come to my classroom who are not really used to this kind of method, they do struggle at first. They'll be like, oh, what should I say? Or do my opinions really matter? Or I thought I learn English here. What am I doing? Kind of thing. But they slowly and then um, it's a lot of my students in the ESL classrooms wanted to improve their speaking skills and listening. So I think it also aligns really well in discussion activities, right? Because they're supposed to speak
Mm-hmm.
in order to improve speaking. A lot of the students or learners, they think, oh, I want to be good at English, but most of the time it's very general. Okay, you want to be good at English, but what's your purpose? Or what's your goal,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So but most of the time, what I see is the learners, they learned English like in those classrooms and they
Mm-hmm.
know about the language, but they don't really have much experience using it. So I think like me as a teacher, I really try to almost push them right into that environment for them to speak more, speak up, and have that
Mm-hmm.
communication going in English.
Mm-hmm.
But at first, a lot of students struggle. Maybe they're not confident or they're not comfortable speaking or, stuff like that, right? So
Yeah.
I really try to facilitate that as much as possible. And I
Mm-hmm.
try to make that class atmosphere safe and comfortable for them to speak up.
Yeah, that's a great point you're touching on. It's just how, like, our role and how that affects our
Mhm,
relationships with the students. And how
mhm,
do you think that that has influenced your relationships with your students versus, let's say,
mm,
how it was with your teachers back home? Like, how
mhm.
was your relationship there? How is it with your students now? How does this approach affect that aspect of the classroom?
Mhm.
Mm, right. So looking back on my experience as a student at the relationship between me and the teacher back then, I think how I see it is I think like in certain classrooms, you know how you like you really like this teacher, and then you get interested in the course, and then you work really hard on it, right? So I think I try to be that teacher as much as possible to most students, right? And I really appreciated the teachers who were very approachable and easy to talk to. So I think that's what I am trying to do with my students, right? Being available and, asking them if they're doing okay, if they have any questions or concerns, because a lot of students, the ESL students that I meet in Canada, they're mostly newcomers, or they are trying to adjust to the new environment. So they have a lot of concerns and worries, right? So I think I try, even like outside of the classroom, I think I do try to hear from them as much as possible, even if it's not related to English or language learning. So yeah, compared to what I had back home, that teacher-student relationship, it could have been more like authoritative back then. But I think I try to break that in my classroom as a teacher.
Nice, nice. So you're kind of saying having that kind of equal footing,
Mm-hmm,
equal standing, we're all in this together kind of vibe, right? Which I think is really, really important for building
mm-hmm,
trust and a positive learning environment. In terms of, success and getting good results for students, how do you measure the success of student-centered learning? Is it in test results? Is it in exam results? Is it in applicability? Like, what are the things that you use to
mm-hmm.
measure success if you do?
Mm-hmm. So that's something that can be quite tricky in the student-centered learning, because it depends on the individual, right? But for those assessments, what I try to do is I go for more of the formative assessment, which is their performances, how they did throughout the class, compared to just summative, which is just based on the results and scores and stuff, right? And I think it's important to compare, like, it's especially with the language assessment, it can be very subtle. Some think, oh, I don't think I really improved a lot, but compared to their like initial work and then their final work, it's there is an improvement, but many students don't really see it. So I what I
Mhm.
try to do is kind of, because I think back home, especially in education, a lot of students, they suffer from competition, and I don't
Mm.
really try to promote that in my classroom as much. So I think they should really look back on like how they were, like their past work and then their current work, compared to like comparing scores like with their classmates or
Mhm.
something like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Mhm.
Now, do you think technology can play a role in facilitating student-centered learning in ESL education?
Mm,
And how can that be done?
for sure. It's a big topic now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Technology and everything. Um, in the ESL classroom that I used to teach, I was very it was very nice because we had smart boards in our classrooms, in each of our classroom, and then I tried to utilize as much as possible. For example, when there's class discussions or group discussions going on, and when students don't really understand which word they're talking about or what kind of topic they're talking about, I often use the image tab in the search to show them what we're talking about, and kind of like pull out the resource as we go. I think that was a lot, like most those times that we pull out resources from just searching on an engine. I think that's a good technology
Mm-hmm.
part that I could have used, right? Like in the classroom. But I also saw in between students when they were talking about something and they don't know, I saw them using their own, like their phones, and then showing the images to their classmates too. And I think that was a good
That's true,
usage.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought of that because like just recently I was teaching a really low level class
Mm-hmm.
and vocabulary kept coming up that wasn't planned, but
Mm-hmm.
if you're
Exactly.
student centered, you want to go with the flow of the students, right? But you have the
Right.
computer right there. If you have that in
Exactly.
your classroom, you're like, okay, this is what it is. Or, oh, okay, you
Mm-hmm.
guys want to know more about this? Let's do that. And Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think it can be a little bit scary as well sometimes for newer teachers
Ah,
or teachers who may be teaching
Mm,
online because they have a set plan or a set kind of,
yeah.
right,
timings and things, and they don't want
right,
to
right.
deviate from them. So I think there's sometimes some hesitation. So what advice would you give to fellow ESL teachers, maybe new teachers or those who are just starting, maybe teaching online? What advice would you give them to help them, adopt and to do more student-centered learning? How could they do this?
Right. So I remember when I did my TESOL practicum, I was terrified if things won't go by plan, and even if I wasn't even sure if my plan was
Right,
okay,
exactly,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I got a lot of help from my uh, mentors and the teachers back then, but I think it's really, because in my opinion, personally, teaching really comes from experience, you doing it. I mean, I remember doing like lots of class observations in my student years, like watching classrooms and then, having like reflections on that. But I think teachers learn the most by actually teaching. So the new teachers can be scared at times, but I think they just have to remember, especially in the ESL classrooms,
Hmm.
students are often more scared and they're
Yes.
more terrified than the teacher.
Right.
So I think the teacher really should set that atmosphere where it's okay to make mistakes. And to be honest, I'm not really good with time management. So sometimes when there's like break time and it goes over that certain like 10 or 15 minutes, I try not to freak out and um, try to like manage it, right? So
Hmm.
I think having a plan, of course, is important, but try not to follow it like from A to Z.
Yes.
Hmm.
Having like objectives and activities planned out is nice, but always remember that there will be something coming up,
Yeah.
and don't panic and try to work around it. The flexibility and adaptability is the key.
Yes, that's the
Yeah.
key word there, flexibility, because teaching
Yes.
a language can also be flexible, just like learning it. So
Hmm.
you have to set
Exactly.
that example that students should follow, that everything's not always going to go perfectly.
No.
Everything's not always going to be 100%,
Right.
what can we say, efficient. There's going to be some
Hmm.
inefficiencies and some things that change around, and I think it's
Right.
a good example to set for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Exactly.
so much of what you're saying, and even like in your own experience of like I get a bit of anxiety of I'm going over the time,
Hmm.
comes from also the way we were raised, probably, and the
Right.
way you were educated, right? And
Hmm.
all that. And so, what impact do you think this type of learning, being more student-centered, can have in the long term,
Hmm.
academically, personally, both for you and your students?
Mm.
Because we talk a lot about flexibility, right?
Right, exactly. I think one of the biggest benefits of student-centered learning is really the personal growth, right? So it
Mm,
does depend on the individual, but you can also, like, as you promote student-centered learning in your own classroom, you can see how students grow in different ranges, and it's fine, right? Some students might be they might be more anxious and like they just came to Canada, maybe they're not picking up as much, right? So that's fine. For students who are more comfortable and they've been around already and they're more comfortable with the environment, so maybe they're learning a little bit more, and that's fine. And what I really like about student-centered learning and having students discuss amongst themselves and being each other's resources and everything is the teamwork and having that sense of community building, right? So a lot of what I enjoy doing with my students in the classroom is also taking them to field trips or doing some activities together. Like, for example, I remember teaching last summer and it was really nice out. So I suggested, oh, why don't we go around the neighborhood, have a little picnic, or having like a potluck party, right? So
mm,
having that kind of experience can be very like memorable, right? Even if like they go back home, that will be something. Because compared to just listening to the lecture and studying, of course, like they can help them learn, but having some kind of new experience within the classroom and learning, I think that is very, very important as well.
Yeah, new experiences, new exposures,
Mhm.
and making it about the students, not about you. It's
Mhm.
definitely key. Yeah, I think that's a really good message to promote to our listeners. So looking forward, Amy, how do you see student-centered learning evolving, maybe in the ESL industry, maybe in your own role as well? How are you planning to make your role more student-centered,
Mm.
and how are you going to try to develop that in the future?
Right. Well, for now, working as a English facilitator, uh, I think I am promoting a lot of student-centered learning because I'm mostly doing one-on-one tutoring. So it has to be student-centered. And this is something that I learned a lot from my own teaching experience. That's why I could get to this role and adjust, apply that to what I'm doing right now, right? And in the long run, I believe there will be more student-centered learning promoted in the futures, but more so with the ESL, and then hopefully for the other fields as well, because I think there are more spotlights on like individual learning and how, even like learning styles, right? People learn it on different pace and different styles. So I think that should be one of the principles that can be applied.
Awesome, thank you.
That's great. Now, just to wrap things up, we could talk about this topic forever, but if our listeners would like to connect with you, talk a little bit more about the topic or anything else that you do, how can they connect with you?
Oh, so like do I have to give contact information or
Yeah, yeah, you can share like
What's the
if you
best
have
place they can find you? Yeah.
Instagram, email, or
Oh, yes, I noticed that a lot of people are on LinkedIn now, so they
Mhm,
can definitely contact me through LinkedIn.
mhm.
Perfect. Yeah, that's fine. And
Great.
we'll share that as well, so people can
Sounds
get in
good.
touch and connect with Amy on LinkedIn as
That's
well. But
amazing.
thank you for taking some time to talk to us about this topic. Like Faye said, we could probably talk about it for a long time, but it's just great to get your approach and your
Yeah, thank
perspectives
you.
as a
Mhm.
language learner as well as a teacher as well. So thank you for joining us.
Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you so much. It was really fun.
Okay.